Somewhere over the flat plains of western Kansas, a Google Earth user zoomed in on a patch of land that should have looked like every other square mile of wheat fields and cattle country. Same dusty roads, same irrigation circles, same nothing stretching to the horizon. But something was wrong with this patch of land, 6 miles wide, perfectly geometric, shaped like a star, not a rough star, not an accidental one, a precise multi-pointed radial pattern burned into the earth so deep that 2 centuries of farming, weather and time could not erase it. It shows up in aerial photography, it shows up in satellite imagery, and the closer you look, the more it refuses to have a simple explanation. The official history of western Kansas in the early 1800s is blank. No cities, no infrastructure, no civilization worth mentioning. So who built a 6-mile star into the ground? And why does the shape match architectural patterns from structures across 3 continents that the mainstream says were never connected? Subscribe right now and hit the bell. What we are about to walk through changes the map of human history. The first thing you need to understand about western Kansas is what it looks like from above. Most of the American Great Plains follows a predictable grid when viewed from satellite. The Land Ordinance of 1785 carved the country into townships and sections, and you can see those straight lines stamped across the landscape from space. Everything is square. Roads follow section lines, fields follow roads. The star pattern breaks that grid completely. It is not aligned to cardinal directions. It sits at an angle oriented to something the 1785 survey system did not account for. Its points extend outward in a radial arrangement, and from directly above, the shape reads as deliberate, mathematical, intentional. Researchers who have spent time with the aerial imagery describe it as matching a star fortress, the specific type of defensive and civic architecture that dominated major population centers across Europe and Central Asia from roughly the 1400s through the 1800s. These structures were called star forts because of their distinctive pointed bastions designed to eliminate blind spots and maximize coverage. They were expensive to build. They took years. They required engineering knowledge that did not come from scratch. The surviving examples in Europe sit in the middle of cities: Palmanova in Italy, Naarden in the Netherlands, Bourtange, Coevorden. They were built around populations. They exist because there were people worth defending. If what is sitting in western Kansas matches that typology, then at some point there were people in western Kansas worth defending too. That is the question mainstream archaeology does not want to answer, because the answer unravels the timeline we have been given. The Tartaria hypothesis is the framework researchers use to describe what they believe was a global civilization that existed before the history we are taught. The name comes from a region historically called Great Tartary, which appeared on European maps as late as the 1700s as a massive landmass spanning from Eastern Europe through Central Asia and into Siberia. It was labelled on those maps, named, treated as a real geopolitical entity. Then it disappeared, not from the land, from the maps, from the books, from the official record. What replaced it was a story about sparsely populated wilderness gradually settled by European explorers who found nothing of significance wherever they went. Empty land, empty plains, empty continents waiting to be filled. But the anomalies keep showing up. Across North America, South America, Australia and Central Asia, there are structures, earthworks and geoglyphs that do not fit the official timeline. Too old to be colonial, too sophisticated to be primitive, too geometrically precise to be natural. And they keep appearing in locations the history books describe as uninhabited wilderness. Western Kansas in the early 1800s was described by American explorers as barren and inhospitable. Zebulon Pike passed through in 1806 and reported essentially nothing. The land was considered so worthless it was not formally surveyed until decades later. And yet, 6 miles wide, multi-pointed, buried in the earth. To understand why this specific shape matters, you need to understand what star forts actually represented. They were not just military installations. In the early modern period, roughly 1500 to 1800, star forts were the physical signature of advanced statecraft. They appeared wherever centralized, sophisticated civilizations decided to plant a permanent presence. They required hydraulic knowledge, mathematical precision, and the administrative organization to feed and supply the populations that built them. The star shape is a solution to a geometric problem. Traditional round or square fortifications created dead zones where attackers could shelter outside the defender's field of fire. The pointed bastion eliminated those dead zones by creating overlapping coverage. Every point covered the walls beside it. Every wall was covered by a point. You do not arrive at this design by accident. You arrive at it through a tradition of military architecture passed down and refined across generations, which means if the Kansas Formation was built using this design logic, it was built by people connected to that tradition. People with access to a broader body of architectural and mathematical knowledge. The mainstream says those people did not exist in western Kansas before European settlement. The ground says something different. There is a pattern in how anomalies like this get handled. First, they are ignored. The aerial photographs of the Kansas Formation have existed for years. Satellite imagery has made it visible to anyone with an internet connection. But it does not appear in academic journals. It does not generate expeditions. It generates forum threads passed around outside institutional channels. Second, when ignoring fails, a counter-explanation appears. Natural formation, geological accident, irrigation infrastructure. None of those explanations survive contact with the actual measurements. Irrigation circles in Kansas are exactly that. Circles. They do not produce 6-mile radial star patterns. Geological formations in the region produce mesas, arroyos, and river valleys. They do not produce precise multi-pointed geometric forms. The natural explanation requires the formation to be natural. The more time researchers spend with the data, the less natural it looks. What makes this formation particularly significant is not just its shape, it is its age signature. When anomalous structures are found, one of the first questions researchers ask is how deep they are buried. In regions with consistent sedimentation rates, depth is a rough indicator of age. If a region accumulates roughly 1 centimeter of sediment per decade, then a structure buried 1 meter down is approximately 1,000 years old. 2 meters means 2,000 years. The math is imprecise but directionally useful. The Kansas Formation is not visible from ground level. It only appears from altitude. That means it is buried under significant sediment accumulation, not sitting on the surface. And the depth of its burial in a region with Kansas's sedimentation history points toward a construction date that predates European contact entirely. If this structure predates European settlement, built before Lewis and Clark, before Pike, before the Louisiana Purchase, then who built it? The Tartarian framework offers an answer. It says the civilization that built structures like this was already here. Sophisticated, geographically widespread, and deeply connected across distances, we are told were impassable. And that something happened to it, possibly in the mid-1800s, that erased it from the physical world and from the official records simultaneously. What that event was is one of the deepest questions in this research space. The answers that come back are not comfortable. There is a body of research called mud flood documentation, and it sits at the intersection of architectural history, geology, and the Tartarian hypothesis. In cities across Europe, North America, and Central Asia, there are buildings that appear to have been partially buried. Ground floors sit below current street level. Windows that should be at eye height are half submerged in earth. Doorways open onto nothing because the surrounding land has risen. First floors converted to basements. These buildings show no signs of having been constructed this way. They show signs of having been buried after the fact. The architecture above the sediment line is detailed, ornate, classical. Below it, stripped and sealed, built for a whirl at a different elevation before the elevation changed. If this is what happened in the cities, what happened in the countryside? The Western Kansas Formation gives one possible answer. Whatever was there at ground level is now invisible from the surface. It exists as a ghost in the soil, readable only from altitude because the geometric precision of its design is still visible in the differential absorption of water and nutrients by the plant life growing over it. It did not disappear. It was buried. The architectural connection that keeps surfacing is the relationship between the Kansas Formation and structures in Central Asia and Eastern Europe that appear on the oldest surviving maps of the Great Tartary region. Maps from the 1600s and 1700s show the interior of the Tartary region dotted with named cities. Cities with enough permanence to appear on maps produced in London and Amsterdam. Many of those cities, when researchers try to locate their physical remains, either do not exist or exist only as earthwork outlines, visible from altitude, the same signature as Kansas, buried, legible only from above. The argument is that these are not separate anomalies, they are instances of the same phenomenon, the same civilization, the same architectural vocabulary, building across a connected territory that spanned far more of the Earth than the official map of ancient history acknowledges. The star pattern is the signature. It shows up in Europe, it shows up in Asia, it shows up in the American interior, and the explanation for each instance is either silence or a localized origin story that ignores the obvious repetition. Great Tartary was labelled on maps, then the maps were redrawn, the history books were written using the new maps, and the world that existed before the redrawing was buried, sometimes literally. You might be sitting with a reasonable objection. Why would the history of an entire civilization be erased? One line of thinking says it is about land ownership. If the Americas were not empty wilderness when Europeans arrived, the entire legal and moral framework of colonial land seizure collapses. The land was not discovered. It was taken from heirs to a civilization that built 6-mile geometric earthworks in Kansas and star fortresses across 3 continents. Another line points to the technology question. If a pre-existing global civilization had access to knowledge we do not currently acknowledge, then the story of human progress as a linear ascent from primitive to modern is not the real story. The real story is regression, a high point lost. Humanity rebuilding from rubble after a catastrophe no one was permitted to fully describe. A third line points to institutional inertia. Academic disciplines are built on consensus maintained by peer review, controlled by journals built on the existing model. A discovery that breaks the model does not get published, it gets shelved. Not because of conspiracy, but because systems protect what they were built on. All 3 are probably partially true. None require a shadowy global cabal. They only require human institutions behaving like human institutions. There is a practical question. No one in mainstream academia has attempted to answer. If the Western Kansas Formation is not what Tartarian researchers say it is, what is it? The aerial imagery is public. The coordinates are shared freely. The geometric measurements are documented. The comparison to known star fort typologies is available to anyone who looks. And the response from academic archaeology has been silence, not a refutation, not an alternative explanation. Silence. The researchers working on this material are not asking for the model to be accepted overnight. They are asking for a ground survey, core samples at the formation site, the kind of basic geological and archaeological assessment that would be deployed without hesitation if the same pattern appeared in a part of the world where an ancient civilization was already officially recognized. In a field that regularly mobilizes significant resources to investigate far more ambiguous anomalies, the absence of any institutional response to something this clear, this measurable, and this visually obvious is itself a data point. You cannot look at that silence and conclude the formation is not there. It is there. The only question is what it means. Give them the investigation and let the evidence speak. A 6-mile geometric formation sits in western Kansas. Buried, visible from altitude, matching the architectural signature of sophisticated state-level civilization. The location should contain no evidence of pre-colonial construction according to official history. The academic establishment has declined to look. The Tartarian framework says this formation connects to buried cities in Central Asia, to partially submerged European buildings, to geometric earthworks on every inhabited continent, to a civilization so large and so connected that erasing it required rewriting the maps, the textbooks, and the baseline assumption of what human beings were capable of before the modern era. That civilization did not simply vanish into the soil of western Kansas. It is still there, 6 miles wide, waiting for someone with the courage to look. If you made it this far, you are the kind of person who actually wants to know. Hit subscribe. New research every week, and the next video goes deeper into the buried city signatures appearing across the American interior in places where the official timeline says there was nothing. The map is wrong. And we are only getting started.